So I'm going to start with just a couple of basic definitions from the legislation, starting with what is real-time fence line monitoring. SB36 defines that as equipment that continuously measures, records, and reports in real time pollutant concentrations, and those are ones originating from ground level fugitive emission sources at or near a facility property boundary, and that provides coverage of the entire boundary. Here's a couple of examples of systems at two different facilities. And this diagram just describes how the system works. So you have a transmitter which shines a beam, either infrared or ultraviolet of light to a receiver. And then any concentrations crossing that beam path are automatically detected and recorded. So that brings up the question of what are fugitive emissions. And I have this diagram, minimize you guys on my screen. I have this diagram. It's of an example rubber manufacturing facility. And you can see here's the facility fence line. In this case, the raw materials, which include catalysts, chemicals, and raw feedstock, are brought in by trucks, and it's moved to the storage area. And fugitive emissions are created whenever the packaging is open or if there's an accidental spill of any of the catalyst, chemicals, or feedstock. It is then at some point transferred to this tightly enclosed process where the raw feedstock and chemicals are placed under high heat and high pressure, and are very powerful exhaust vent hoods that are required to capture at least 98% of the created emissions and route those to a control device. And then the remaining 1 or 2% of emissions come out these very high, at the top of these very high stacks. And those are known as the controlled point emissions at a facility. These other processes also represent sources of ground level fugitive emissions. So first you have the area where the large sheets of rubber are cut into smaller pieces. That's transferred to this area where the smaller pieces of rubber are cured under low heat and low pressure. And then finally, fugitive emissions are created when those smaller pieces of rubber are packaged for transport off the facility. Now, for the entire time I worked for EPA, and for a very long time, fugitive emissions, the thinking about those they're very hard to control, as you can imagine, but also that relative to the point process emissions, they were very small in comparison. Well, that thinking was completely blown apart in 2015 when EPA determined that 85% of all refinery benzene emissions resulted from uncontrolled ground level fugitive sources. So now for SB 356 covered facilities and pollutants, as I might have mentioned, it's the 117 highest risk facilities, which include 99 chemical manufacturers and 18 petroleum refineries. And it's the 17 highest toxicity weighted risk drivers, and also the highly toxic pollutants that are most frequently accidentally released in Louisiana. And Scott Eustace, in the last 24 hours, created this fantastic map of all 117 covered facilities. I was not surprised by the Cancer Alley facilities or the Calcasieu Parish facilities, but I was kind of surprised by the number of facilities just north and south of New Orleans. And all of these facilities just north of Baton Rouge. And you can see the facilities are distributed all across the state. So let's move to what these systems cost. And there's been a lot of conversation, and that's actually the factor that's killed the previous 4 bills that were introduced. So as a reminder, these recommended monitors simultaneously measure up to 100 pollutants at leaks from 500 to 1,000 meters. And if you're like me and have a hard time imagining how long 1,000 meters is, this is equivalent to the length of 5 to 10 football fields, so very large areas. The average cost ranges for 250 to almost 630 in capital, and that's for 4 to 10 monitors, equipment shelters, a data logger, and a required weather station, and then 25,000 in annual maintenance costs. The system also importantly includes a data platform and a website that collects, analyzes, and stores the real-time data and allows you to visualize both historical and the real-time data on graphs, maps, tables. And the cost per facility for developing and customizing these websites would be about $2,000 to $3,500 per facility, with annual cost up to $40,000 for data QA, QC, and then data updates. Those costs also include the real-time alert system that are generated whenever concentrations crossing the fence line exceed a health-based threshold, and those alerts are automatically distributed to the facility, parish officials, first responders, and any resident that signs up, and you can get the alerts either in text, emails, or phone calls. So let's talk a little bit about the past industry statements that have virtually killed the legislation. So this quote here is from a 2022 Advocate article by David Mitchell, in which he reports that industry representatives have previously testified that a new monitoring requirement would affect more than 532 large-scale operations, which that part was true, but then goes on to say, and the monitoring costs would cost industry up to $1.6 billion, which translates to from almost $1 million to $2.8 million facility to install. So I've just for comparison put in 3 examples here. You may remember that horrendous chlorine leak from Biolab. So like most of our chemical manufacturing facilities, the system would only require 4 monitors and would cost just over $250,000. And then Sasol, who is more regularly shaped, would require 6 monitors at a cost of $378,500 in capital. And then Marathon, which is the nation's 3rd largest refinery, would require 10 open path monitors and cost almost $630,000 in capital. And that might seem like a lot until you compare it to those facilities' annual earnings, but more important, for instance, Biolab's, the cost of its system would only represent 2.6%, less than what we pay in sales tax of its annual average $9.6 million in tax exemptions. The situation is even more for Sasol. The cost of its monitoring system represents 0.03% of its annual tax exemptions. And then Marathon's cost would represent just under 0.2% of its 364 million annual tax exemptions. So virtually these costs represent a rounding error of the tax breaks that each of these facilities get per year. And so that's one comparison of costs, but it's probably more important to talk about what is the cost of not requiring these facilities to install fence line monitoring, real-time fence line monitoring. You may recall the evaluation that we did for 3 years of data, which identified 27 serious accidental release incidents at 18 facilities across 18 parishes. And those releases resulted in local residents being exposed to more than 1.1 million pounds of toxic pollutants. They resulted in 2 confirmed deaths, 123 confirmed hospital visits, more than 16,000 people evacuated, and more than 106,000 sheltering in place, and tremendous costs to the facilities. During that 3 years, 7 of those 18 facilities paid more than $130 million in fines and penalties. There was more than $100 million in property damage and product loss. At least 27 wrongful death and injury worker lawsuits were filed, and virtually tens of thousands of residents are now represented in class action lawsuits. And so I just want to take a minute and reflect what difference it might have made to all of those residents and first responders and local officials if anytime, day or night, they had been able to call up a website like this California Phillips 66 website, where they could see at any fence line area along the facility what the concentrations of benzene were. And they could note that between 4 and 5 p.m., right here on the eastern side of the facility, some accidental release of uncontrolled fugitive emissions passed through that fence line, raising the benzene concentrations to 6.45. And if you notice here on this graph, if they had been just a little bit higher and exceeded the acute exposure level here, that would have generated real-time alerts. So that brings me to our SB356 talking points. It's that they start with SB356 is evidence-based, and it's designed to be protective and cost-effective. It's targeted at the highest risk pollutants and facilities. It helps parish officials, first responders, and prevent or greatly mitigate the impacts. It provides residents with 24/7 real-time accurate information and also early warnings compared to the 2023 SB 35 and the other past introduced bills. It reduces the cover of pollutants by 93% from 235 to the 17 most toxic. It reduces the covered facilities 75% from 476 to the 17 highest risk. And then it greatly reduces industry costs by enabling real-time leak detection and quick repairs, reduces worker deaths, injuries, property damage, and product loss, prevents federal and state agencies from issuing violations and paying penalties, and it reduces lengthy, expensive class action and working lawsuits. And that brings me to the end where you can ask me questions, but I really want us to have a dialogue about how GEO and ICC can support SB 356. And